We begin tonight with breaking news. Canada has officially surpassed the United States in wheat exports.
Canada just secured 2 major wheat export deals.
You've seen the headlines: soaring food prices, empty grain silos, farmers protesting. But what if the story behind your rising grocery bill isn't just inflation, but something far more strategic? In 2024, U.S. wheat exports to Asia plunged by billions. Shipments delayed, deals stalled, and for the first time in decades, trust started to fade. That's when Canada moved in, signing multi-year wheat deals with Japan, Egypt, Germany, and more. Where the U.S. hesitated, Canada delivered. Today, we break down the 7 countries now choosing Canadian wheat over American grain. And the final country on this list? It could rewrite everything about U.S. power across the Pacific. Number 1. Spain. In the quiet kitchens of southern Spain, the scent of warm bread and fresh pasta fills the air. But behind this familiar comfort, a silent shift is taking place, one that few outside the industry are even noticing. For decades, Spanish bakers and pasta producers were fiercely loyal to American durum wheat. Shipments from the U.S. Midwest, especially Kansas and North Dakota, fueled the country's culinary heart, from crusty baguettes in Barcelona to industrial pasta lines feeding millions across southern Europe. But in 2024, that loyalty began to crack. The European Union introduced sweeping new food regulations, tightening standards on chemical residue, glyphosate, and post-harvest pesticide treatments. And suddenly, U.S. wheat shipments were flagged at customs, delayed for inspections, and often failed to meet compliance. Factories stalled, deliveries became inconsistent, bakers complained. While American exporters scrambled to negotiate, Canada responded with precision. Wheat growers in Alberta and Saskatchewan, already subject to stricter domestic farming standards, swiftly adapted to EU requirements. They didn't just comply, they over-delivered. Canadian shipments came with full documentation: traceable, carbon-neutral logistics, pre-tested protein content, and contamination screening. It was everything Spanish regulators demanded, and more. By early 2025, Spain's National Grain Procurement Council made its move. Over 70% of new durum wheat contracts were redirected from U.S. suppliers to Canadian cooperatives. But this wasn't just a supply chain decision. It was a strategic pivot. Insiders close to Spain's Ministry of Trade confirmed Canadian wheat wasn't just cleaner. It had higher protein, better consistency, and superior strength for both artisan baking and large-scale pasta output. Canadian exporters even agreed to co-invest in joint grain storage hubs in Valencia and Bilbao, securing a reliable future pipeline. The first containers from Vancouver docked in March. By May, entire flour networks across Madrid were powered by Canadian wheat. And while this shift may look subtle from the outside, inside Spain, it's symbolic. Because bread here isn't just food. It's identity, it's history. And Spain won't gamble that on late shipments and unpredictable partners. With U.S. export policy caught in political gridlock and transatlantic tariffs looming, Spain chose certainty over sentiment. The result? A 21% drop in American wheat shipments to Spain during the first half of 2025. Meanwhile, Canadian exports more than doubled. But this isn't just about Spain. Italy, Portugal, Greece. The rest of the Mediterranean bread belt is watching closely. If Spain's move proves successful, it could trigger a domino effect across southern Europe, one that could cut the United States out of a market it once dominated. And this is only the beginning. Because while Spain quietly changes where its grain comes from, the next country, it isn't just adjusting recipes, it's rebuilding its entire food security strategy around Canada. Number 2. Pakistan. Flooded roads, shuttered ports, empty silos. In late 2024, Pakistan faced a wheat emergency unlike anything in recent memory. Torrential monsoon floods devastated the Indus River basin, wiping out over 30% of the country's domestic yield. The government scrambled. Millions of families were at risk. Emergency procurement orders were issued. But when Islamabad reached for help this time, they didn't call Washington. They called Ottawa, for decades, U.S. Soft white wheat from the Pacific Northwest had powered Pakistan's food subsidies, filling public bakeries, school kitchens, and emergency ration bags. The relationship was familiar, predictable. But when crisis struck, America hesitated. Offers were slow. Port routing was complex. Pricing tiers were tied to speculative futures contracts. It was business as usual in the middle of a disaster. Canada responded differently. Within days, Canadian producers issued a full-service offer. Competitively priced hard red spring wheat, flexible shipping timelines, port insurance, and embedded agricultural support teams. Grain from Saskatchewan and Alberta was loaded, insured, and on ships to Port Qasim in under 2 weeks. But that was just the beginning. Canada went further, embedding trade specialists inside Pakistan's Ministry of Food Security, helping coordinate logistics across inland provinces. Canadian cooperatives signed multi-year supply contracts designed to stabilize prices across procurement cycles. And crucially, all transactions were certified under Islamic finance standards, removing a long-standing barrier U.S. firms had failed to address for years. By March 2025, Canada had replaced the United States as Pakistan's primary wheat supplier. It wasn't just a one-off contract. It was a realignment. Pakistan's population, approaching 240 million, is projected to grow rapidly while facing worsening climate shocks. That means the country's reliance on imports will only increase. And now, Canada is at the center of that future. In a televised session before Parliament, Pakistan's Minister of Food called Canada a strategic partner in food sovereignty. The language was deliberate and loaded. U.S. shipments, once dominant, declined by over 40% year on year. American officials attempted to downplay the shift, calling it temporary. But on the ground, Canadian wheat was already fueling national kitchens, school programs, and private bakeries alike. Even flour mills in Punjab and Sindh, once reliant on American wheat blends, have begun recalibrating for Canadian grain. Why? Because it's cleaner, more consistent, and it shows up on time. Insiders at the Canadian Wheat Board call it a beachhead, not just a sale. And in Islamabad, trade analysts agree. Canada didn't just deliver wheat. It delivered reliability, flexibility, and respect. And that matters. In regions where food insecurity is political dynamite, trust is everything. Canada earned it. The US lost it. But if Pakistan's pivot was shaped by crisis, the next country on this list, it made its move from a position of strength, and what it just did to US wheat exports could change Southeast Asia forever. Number 3. Indonesia. In the early morning markets of Jakarta, change isn't loud, it's quiet. But for global exporters watching closely, the silence says everything. American wheat is disappearing. Where once you saw sacks from Oregon and Washington stacked in bakeries and noodle factories, you now see Canadian logos, cleaner labels, consistent grain, and far fewer customs issues. For decades, Indonesia was one of America's most important wheat buyers. The U.S. supplied millions of tons annually, powering the country's food industry from instant noodles and biscuits to school meals and commercial bakeries. But in the last 2 years, something shifted. It wasn't a tariff war. It wasn't politics. It was frustration. Indonesian importers had long complained of inconsistent quality, late shipments, and tightening U.S. trade conditions. Customs bottlenecks in Tanjung Priok, the country's busiest port, delayed containers for weeks. U.S. suppliers offered excuses. Canadian suppliers offered solutions. And it worked. By late 2024, Canadian wheat began flooding into Indonesia's ports. But this wasn't just a product swap. It was a supply chain evolution. Canadian exporters modernized everything. AD, halal-certified wheat processing, digitally traceable shipping documentation, local partnerships with distributors in Jakarta and Surabaya, respect for Indonesia's food safety, and religious norms. when Indonesia's two largest food conglomerates, Mayora and Indofood, signed multi-year contracts with wheat cooperatives in Alberta and Saskatchewan, the signal was loud and clear. America had been replaced. These were legacy accounts once considered untouchable. Now, they're Canadian. Today, Canadian wheat dominates Java's instant noodle production over 100 million servings per day. It fuels bakeries in Sumatra. It's even creeping into the high-end pastry segment once held by U.S. suppliers. By mid-2025, U.S. wheat exports to Indonesia had plummeted by nearly 50%. Not because of drought, not because of cost, but because Indonesia stopped waiting for America to fix its broken system. And here's the kicker. Canadian wheat often sells at a higher price, but the premium includes punctuality, consistency, and compliance with local regulations. It's a full-service solution. The US is still selling a product, and in Southeast Asia, that difference matters. Indonesia's quiet exit sent a message to regional giants like Thailand, Vietnam, and the Philippines. When reliability matters more than loyalty, Canada wins. That is riding, set of the come, as ready apted to it cried. But as disruptive as Indonesia's pivot has been, the next country's decision was even more shocking because it didn't come from desperation. It came from a place where bread means survival. Number 4. Egypt. In Egypt, bread isn't just food, it's life. They call it aish, which literally means life itself. Every morning, millions of Egyptians line up at street stalls and bakeries for subsidized flatbread. It's the largest government-backed bread program in the Arab world. And for decades, it relied on one quiet foundation: U.S. wheat. Shipped from ports in the Gulf of Mexico, American wheat was milled into flour and turned into loaves that sustained an entire nation. But that era is ending. In early 2024, Egypt shocked observers by signing a long-term wheat deal with Canada, displacing a century-old reliance on American grain. And the move wasn't symbolic, it was systemic. For years, U.S. wheat had been arriving late, stored poorly, or failing Egypt's increasingly strict inspections for mold and moisture. In two major incidents, U.S. shipments were outright rejected at port, triggering food security panic in Cairo. Meanwhile, Canadian officials moved quietly. The Canadian Grain Commission coordinated with Egypt's General Authority for Supply Commodities. Test shipments from Saskatchewan and Manitoba not only passed, they exceeded expectations. Higher protein levels, stronger gluten content, lower moisture, cleaner traceability. By mid-2024, Egypt's cabinet approved a contingency import plan that quickly became permanent. Canada was in. America was out. Under the new contracts, over 30% of Egypt's state-backed wheat imports through 2026 will come from Canada. And while the headlines focused on tonnage, the real shift was in tone. During a live press briefing, Egypt's Minister of Supply described Canada as a strategic partner in both quality and conduct. It was a not-so-subtle jab at Washington, and everyone in D.C. heard it. But this was more than just trade friction. Egypt is the world's largest wheat importer. A procurement shift here ripples across the global market from Ukraine and Australia to Russia and the US. And that's exactly what's happening. Canada's foothold in Egypt has opened the door to possible contracts in Morocco, Jordan, and parts of West Africa regions where food security is fragile and trust is everything. The US once treated Egypt as a locked-in client, but that assumption has now collapsed. American trade envoys tried to renegotiate. Cairo declined. Because in Egypt, food is political, it's stability. And leaders aren't willing to bet their regime on late shipments and chemical disputes. For Canada, it's a massive win. For the US, it's a reputational wound. But as dramatic as Egypt's move is, the next country's decision wasn't born in breadlines. It came from the heart of Europe's industrial power, where precision matters more than politics. Number 5. Germany. No protests, no headlines, no public outcry. Just silence and spreadsheets. In procurement offices across Berlin and Frankfurt, Germany, the economic engine of Europe has been quietly cutting the United States out of its wheat supply chain. It didn't happen overnight. For decades, U.S. wheat was standard in German imports. Grain from Kansas and North Dakota fueled bakeries in Hamburg, Berlin, and Munich. It supported biotech labs, food conglomerates, and small artisan producers alike. But beginning in 2022, tensions started to build. Germany's environmental standards are among the strictest in the world. Consumers demanded cleaner, traceable food. Regulators enforced lower glyphosate levels, non-GMO sourcing, and lower emission shipping. U.S. wheat, especially bulk shipments by sea, struggled to meet those expectations. Canada? It adapted fast. By 2023, Canadian wheat exporters were voluntarily aligning with new EU sustainability benchmarks. They shifted to cleaner logistics, digitized traceability platforms, and pre-qualified for German tenders before regulations even took effect. Hard red spring wheat from Saskatchewan became the preferred alternative. It offered better gluten strength for Germany's bread sector and more consistent milling for industrial processors. And then came the moment everything changed. Germany's largest bakery conglomerate, Lean AG, issued a public statement in late 2024. We will no longer source wheat from U.S. suppliers in our commercial operations. They cited inconsistent quality, volatile shipping timelines, and environmental misalignment. The company signed long-term contracts with Canadian cooperatives instead. That statement didn't just shake up the food industry. It rattled Washington. Because if Germany, the most quality-obsessed food market in Europe, walks away, others follow. And that's exactly what's happening. Poland, Austria, Switzerland, they've all begun reassessing their U.S. grain imports. Some are already piloting contracts with Canadian suppliers, and more are expected to follow. In 2024, Canadian wheat exports to Germany surged by 72%. U.S. wheat shipments dropped to their lowest levels since the Cold War. And it's not just about food. It's about symbolism. Germany's shift signals a larger trend, a pivot away from legacy trade partners and toward those who adapt, align, and respect evolving standards. One German trade official said it plainly: "We haven't turned against the United States. We've turned toward reliability." In play, and that reliability now wears a red maple leaf. But while Germany's decision was made in boardrooms, the next country's shift came from the streets, from food stalls, factories, and military supply chains. And for Washington, it wasn't just unexpected, it was personal. Number 6, South Korea. In Seoul, change usually comes with fanfare, technology launches, policy announcements, headlines. But this time, it was quiet, almost too quiet. For over 50 years, South Korea was one of the most reliable buyers of U.S. wheat. It wasn't just trade. It was a bond. A post-war alliance, backed by billions in aid and decades of agricultural exchange. From school meal programs to military reserves, from ramen factories to convenience store kimbap, American wheat powered South Korea's daily life. Until now. In late 2023, murmurs started inside the Ministry of Agriculture. Procurement officers raised concerns about U.S. shipments, delays at port-hand, failed inspections, high pesticide residues, inconsistent milling quality. And then came the tipping point. 2 high-volume shipments failed South Korea's Food and Drug Safety Ministry testing, triggering public backlash and political pressure. American wheat, once considered safe and reliable, was suddenly a liability. Canada moved swiftly. The Canadian Grain Commission worked directly with Korean officials to certify shipments under revised national standards. Hard red spring wheat from Manitoba and Alberta met every benchmark: clean, consistent, and traceable. But Canada didn't stop there. They offered digital tracking, halal-compliant processing, port flexibility through Busan, and faster customs clearance. They even embedded export specialists into Korean logistics teams to ensure uninterrupted supply. By early 2025, South Korea signed a 3-year procurement deal with Canadian cooperatives, displacing long-held contracts with American grain suppliers. It was a shock to DC because South Korea wasn't just another buyer. It was an ally, a symbol of post-war trade loyalty. Losing that account wasn't just economic, it was emotional, and the fallout came fast. By mid-2025, U.S. wheat exports to South Korea had dropped by over 40%. Canadian shipments were on track to fully overtake by early 2026. Even major food brands like Paris Baguette and Nongshim restructured their supply chains around Canadian wheat. Not for price, but for performance, consistency, trust. Behind closed doors, American exporters tried to renegotiate. But Korean officials were clear. They were done gambling with national food security. And this pivot, quiet, deliberate, and decisive, sent a message across East Asia: even America's closest allies will walk away when trust is broken. But as painful as South Korea's shift was for U.S. trade officials, the final country on this list hit the hardest. Because it wasn't just a buyer. It was the crown jewel. Number 7. Japan. It's the rupture no one believed could happen. No sanctions, no headlines, no trade war. Just quiet exits, subtle policy shifts, and one game-changing decision after another. Japan, the most loyal wheat buyer the U.S. has ever had, is walking away and doing it with breathtaking precision. For decades, Japan was the crown jewel of American agricultural exports. Over 3 million metric tons of wheat shipped annually from Pacific Northwest ports to Yokohama and Kobe, fed an entire ecosystem: noodles, pastries, bread, udon. This wasn't just business. It was diplomacy baked into food. Since the 1952nd, U.S.-Japan trade frameworks ensured a stable pipeline of American white wheat into Japan's tightly regulated food sector. High quality, reliable, trusted. But in late 2023, cracks began to show. Public reports revealed that several U.S. shipments had failed. Japan's rigorous inspections for pesticide residue and moisture content, triggering shockwaves in the food industry and causing Japan's Ministry of Agriculture to act. Quietly, they launched a comparative assessment. U.S. wheat was tested against imports from Canada, Australia, and even Eastern Europe. The verdict? Damning. U.S. grain showed higher chemical residue, inconsistent milling, and port delays due to labor shortages. Meanwhile, Canadian wheat, particularly from Manitoba and Saskatchewan, met or exceeded every benchmark. Higher protein, better gluten elasticity, traceable climate-aligned certifications. And in early 2024, Japan's second-largest milling cooperative, Nissan Sun Group, made the break public. Over 60% of our new procurement contracts will come from Canada. Weeks later, Yamazaki Baking Company followed. By mid-2025, Canadian wheat had overtaken American wheat in Japan's most critical sectors: baking and noodles. The shift wasn't just symbolic, it was structural. Then came the final blow. In March 2025, Japan signed a direct government-to-government food supply agreement with Canada, bypassing private brokers and eliminating tariffs on Canadian wheat through 2029. That deal sent a chilling signal to Washington. Japan now sees Canada, not the United States, as its strategic food partner. The USDA estimates that the loss of Japanese contracts could cost American wheat farmers over $1 billion annually. But this isn't just about dollars. It's about trust. Japan's food sector is arguably the most quality-obsessed in Asia. If they've lost confidence in U.S. wheat, how long before other nations follow? Because Japan wasn't supposed to leave. It was supposed to be the unshakable ally, the final firewall. But now, that firewall is gone. And so is the illusion of permanence in America's export dominance. One Canadian trade analyst put it simply: this wasn't just Canada rising, it was America falling. If you're seeing this shift where you live, if prices are rising, labels are changing, and American products are slowly vanishing, you're not imagining it. This isn't just about wheat. It's about trust. And it's happening one contract at a time. Comment below if your country or industry is already feeling the Canadian pivot. And don't forget to subscribe, because this is only the beginning of a trade revolution no one in Washington saw coming.